One of the more interesting things that I find in implementing network address translation, because there's so many possible options for it, is deciding, this is the tricky part, deciding what you need done first and then following up on the firewall to implement the policy that does what you want it to do. So if we start off with the challenge of Lois, who's at this computer, and Lois is at 10.1.0. something. So she's a DHCP client. She got an IP address in this 10.1.0 network. Her default gateway is .7, which is the firewall. And if our goal is to translate her to a specific IP address from a pool of addresses on the outside, we could do that. If we want to do translations to a specific IP address for her and have that mapped every single time, we could do that. If we want everybody on this subnet to map to a specific IP address as they go out, the same IP address with Pat, we could do that. Or if we wanted Lois and everybody else to overload on the existing interface that the firewall is already using, so that everybody who's leaving the network, their source address is going to be swapped out and have it appear to be, this is the 23 network, 23.1.2.0. So if we did that, we could overload every IP address on the inside, all the source addresses, to the one IP address of 23.1.2.7. So there's lots of options based on what we have available. So if we have one IP address and it's the IP address that the firewall is currently using, we're going to use, that would be an example of using PAT, port address translation. And furthermore, it'd be dynamic PAT, because we aren't building those translations until users start sending traffic through the firewall, at which time we start mapping them to that same IP address. And then the firewall, using NAT tables, is tracking all the ports involved so he or she can do the correct untranslations on the way back. So what if we want to do that game where we translate almost everybody to the single IP address, but we want to have a few exceptions? How do we pull that off? Well, on the firewall, there is a 3-section approach to doing this. 1, 2, and 3. And the first section is for manual rules for NAT. And when I say NAT, it can be NAT or PAT. And then 3, the third set, is manual rules. And the middle set is auto. And the reason this is here is this, is when we start creating rules, we can choose for most of our plain Jane translations, we can use Auto NAT, and we can dump them all into this Auto NAT section. And then there's a hierarchy of rules as far as which ones take priority if they're in conflict, if we just dump them all into the Auto NAT. But if we have specific translations that we want to exempt from what's happening here, we can manually create rules before the Auto NAT, or we can also manually create rules that go after the Auto NAT, and it's a top-down approach. So as the NAT policies are being looked at, it starts from top to bottom, and as soon as there's a match, it takes hold. So the manual rules that go after Auto NAT would be like catch-all rules where they weren't caught or matched previously in the NAT policy. So for this demonstration, let's do this. Let's simply specify an Auto NAT rule that says anybody that's coming from 10.0.0.0/8, meaning 10 anything. If their source address is 10 anything and their traffic is coming in on an interface that's associated with the inside zone, which this inside interface is, and if traffic is going out any interface that's associated with the outside zone, which this one is, go ahead and translate the source address of whatever it is to the IP address that's currently being used on that outside interface. And one of the cool things is that once we create this rule on the FMC, we associate it with this FTD appliance, and then we push out that configuration by deploying it, we can actually look at this FTD appliance and see what those NAT rules are sitting on the appliance. And if those rules are actually doing translations, we can also look at the translations that are taking place on the firewall itself to verify that it's working. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.